I've been writing about space now for 2 decades, and that SpaceX is the most important story in spaceflight today.
Construction now underway on what could be the future of space travel. SpaceX today broke ground on a new launch facility in South Texas.
Well, that was the moment that SpaceX's giant new rocket exploded after blasting off on its first test flight. Not what the company or NASA perhaps were hoping for. SpaceX putting on a brave face. You heard all that applause.
And yeah, you say people are putting on a brave face. You have it completely wrong, Todd. This was an enormously successful test flight.
Usually the headlines after a launch are quite negative, particularly after the first few. It's like,
it was like Tesla media all over again. I was like getting 2018 PTSD.
Yeah, it's like, Starship explodes and Elon Musk, fails again or whatever. And it's like, no, they've learned so much. And that's why they've been able to improve every single flight.
Right now, we're watching the story of Starship unfold, a daring endeavor to make the first fully reusable rocket and someday to use this next generation rocket to get to Mars. But with great ambitions come great criticisms. Not everyone believes SpaceX will succeed with Starship, but that's just the cost of dreaming big.
Since 2020, at least 5 of SpaceX's attempts to launch its Starship into space have ended with the experimental aircraft blowing up.
SpaceX has been doubted a lot over the years, from their humble and desperate beginnings, avoiding bankruptcy and doing what no one else thought was possible, a private company getting into orbit. This opened the door for an industry-wide shift. Then came not just getting into orbit, but having rocket and reusable be in the same sentence. SpaceX again was the first company to ever successfully reuse a booster, changing the way people viewed the space industry.
Personally, I think reusability is a dream. My answer to respond to a dream is, first of all, you don't wake people up. They have to wake up on their own.
Falcon 9 also wasn't an overnight success, but is the workhorse of the industry today, with many companies now trying to copy the moves SpaceX has made over the decades. Oh, and that dream of reusability? Today, Falcon 9 has lowered launch costs so much that they are 30 times lower than NASA's space shuttle.
That's why I like the story of SpaceX, because I feel like even if you're not a space fan, it's so inspiring. Yeah. You can be the underdog, you can be made fun of, you can be mocked, and if you keep going, if you stay persistent, even the Hail Marys of Falcon 1 Flight 4, right? I mean, it's truly an inspiring story.
Let me introduce you to Eric Berger, who wrote 2 books now about SpaceX. Liftoff, which he released a few years ago about the early Falcon 1 days, and now Re-Entry, which is coming out September 24th, about the Falcon 9 era and reusability.
Talk about why SpaceX. I mean, you've been following the space industry and covering it for so long. Why are they so critical to moving forward?
I think, I've been interested in space my whole life. Started covering NASA during the space shuttle era, NASA right over there, Johnson Space Center right behind you. I mean, the space shuttle missions were great, but they were pretty boring. I mean, I hate to say it, I've got friends who are former astronauts who will be like shaking their heads at me. But it's the same kind of thing. 7 people go to space, they do something for a couple of weeks, and they come back, and then a couple months later, NASA does it again. And it's hard, it's technically challenging, but it got pretty repetitive. And you look kind of out at that government timeline for exploration, and it just never felt like we were really gonna get anywhere. Like there was no concrete plan to go to the moon, no concrete plan to go to Mars. And so the exciting thing about Elon is he comes along at a time where for decades, people had been talking about settling space, right? But that was science fiction stuff. These were kind of loony fringe actors. These were people who had grand plans but weren't really doing it. And he comes along and he has a vision, but he just doesn't have a vision, he implements it. And that's one of the really powerful things about Re-Entry is that, lots of people had talked about reusable rockets before, right? And there'd been all these efforts but no one had done it. And they come along, and this essentially is the story of Re-Entry, is how they did it. And it was hard, and it was long, and it was full of failure. It's just, they've completely changed the industry.
Yeah.
And so I felt like, I'm a journalist, I'm a writer, this is the most important thing happening on my beat, so I really need to go understand it.
Eric was able to get behind-the-scenes stories from early SpaceX employees, revealing how scrappy and challenging the early days were.
What made you want to continue to pick up the pen and tell more of the story?
Well, when I got done with Liftoff, it ended in 2008, and obviously so much more had happened with SpaceX, and I was lucky to have built pretty strong relationships with some of the early critical employees, and they had more story to tell. It kind of felt like the Falcon 9 era was maturing. I started writing the book in 2021 and 2022, and so at that point it was really clear that reuse was viable, that they were going to be able to push this vehicle. The first humans had flown in Dragon, and so it just felt to me like, okay, we have enough evidence now after 15 years of the Falcon 9 era that this is going to be a huge success. The story of Liftoff was they were just kind of living hand to mouth with funding and doing all these crazy things. And what I found is that when I started getting telling the reentry, that scrappy mentality just increased. It was still it wasn't this big mature company with money. Today they have lots of money. You look at what they're doing in Starbase. You've been down there. They're spending billions of dollars, and they are running a finely tuned machine. Back in this era, especially the early Falcon 9 era, it was still very scrappy.
Right.
And so there were just lots of funny stories to tell. And that was really the joy of reporting the book, is you talk to people and you find out all of the crazy stuff they had to do to make those launches go.
SpaceX has revolutionized the space industry, forcing competitors to adapt and inspiring new companies. Without SpaceX, the U.S. space program would likely be far behind where it is today. But there are concerns about SpaceX's future leadership after Elon Musk and Gwynne Shotwell.
I was very intrigued by your epilogue, right? And sort of this idea that SpaceX is the mover, the shaker, they're leading the industry. But will this last forever? And you say no time in the foreseeable future will they be toppled, but eventually they could potentially have a downfall, and you stated some reasons that were interesting to me. I mean, what do you see for the next 10 years, or what are some of your concerns?
So my concern basically boils down to, Elon over 20 years and Gwynne Shotwell and the rest of the people at the company built this fantastic machine, which is arguably a decade ahead of any competitor in the United States, in China, or anywhere around the world, right? In terms of launch, in terms of satellite internet, they have come so far so fast. And the reason they did that fundamentally is because Elon is a driving force of he's this ball of energy just pushing and willing things forward. So my number one concern is he goes away. Maybe he has enough. He wants to focus on X, or he wants to focus on Tesla, or he wants to go do something else, right? Because when he's not around, things slow down, and he is the reason why that Mars vision is so front and present. But I'm also concerned about the political stuff, right? I don't care what his politics are. In my space coverage, I tend to be very apolitical.
Right.
Space itself is fairly non-political. But it was pretty jarring this past week, Ellie, to sort of see Elon, sharing these wonderful images from Polaris Dawn, right? Videos, this incredible mission with Jared Isaacman. And then he'll just throw in 3 or 4 tweets about, about how Kamala is awful about this, or some kind of meme about, that is it plays to a political base, right?
Offering Taylor Swift a child.
These are to a large section of the population, these are pretty disturbing things. And so he's undermining SpaceX's mission, I think. And the mission is to settle Mars, and so now you've got a large part of the world who looks at Elon Musk and says, this is not the person we want extending the light of consciousness into the solar system. And politically too, SpaceX still relies to some extent on government contracts from NASA, the Department of Defense, and clearly some of those political leaders are uncomfortable with his behavior. But look, they're way ahead of everyone right now.
Yeah.
But this is not inevitable. I start the book with the point that when SpaceX started flying the Falcon 9 rocket, they were upstarts. They were, in Gwynne Shotwell's word, they were jackasses, right? No one really believed these guys, of all people, were going to revolutionize the world. And then 12 to 15 years later, they're on top of the world.
Right.
But nothing is inevitable.
He's very divisive right now. A lot of people don't like him. Elon is not like the sole person at SpaceX.
You cannot really separate SpaceX from Elon, I don't think. Like, it is his vision. He is running the company. He is setting the direction. If there's something he doesn't like, it changes like that. But there are 14,000 people at SpaceX doing these amazing, wonderful things, and they believe, they're there because they believe in the mission, right? And so I do think it's important to sort of say, okay, Elon is a person, he has his political views, you know, I may or may not like him. And for some people, that's enough to sort of broad brush SpaceX as some kind of bad actor. But the reality is SpaceX is not a bad actor. They're out there doing these amazing things.
What would the world be like without SpaceX? I mean, where would we be, especially with what happened with Russia?
It's pretty sobering to think about the state of U.S. spaceflight if SpaceX didn't exist, right? In 2014, it was very close. NASA almost just gave all the commercial crew funding to Boeing, right? Not to SpaceX. If SpaceX doesn't exist, we're still relying on Russians to fly to the International Space Station. And the space station, quite frankly, probably doesn't exist because in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, that would have been one of the really powerful ways that they had to exert leverage on the United States politically, and so I think they would have exercised it, and so we would have just had to abandon the U.S. segment of the space station. You look at NASA's space exploration right now, and if there's no SpaceX, we might still be flying on Russian rocket engines. Like to the extent that Starliner actually, Starliner is flying on Russian rocket engines to get to orbit, right? So what happens if Russia says, well, we're not going to provide you those engines anymore for your rocket? And all of a sudden, you don't have a commercial crew program, period. You look at all of the innovation and excitement in China around their sort of quasi-commercial space industry. And the only sort of buttress against that at this time is SpaceX. Like you take SpaceX out of the US launch equation and China's launching 3x, 4x, 5x times more rockets than the United States is. I'm wearing a New Glenn hat. So I like Blue Origin and I really like Jeff Bezos' vision, but they haven't launched an orbital rocket yet. However, if you take SpaceX doesn't exist, then Blue Origin is the innovative and dynamic new space company of our era.
Right.
So just imagine that. I mean, it's and you don't get all of the private funding that's flown into space. So you have all of these companies that have come along in the wake of SpaceX and building like successful businesses or not successful business, but getting funding to try interesting things in space. And so it's just, it's sobering to think about what happens if they didn't exist. So I think one of the questions is what happens going forward, right? And that's one of the concerns I have, because Gwen Shotwell has been a fantastic leader for more than 20 years. She's been at Elon's side the entire way. People think she's this nice person, but man, she's really steel underneath. She's a very strong person. There is no obvious replacement for her. She's now in her 60s. You hear from time to time that she'd like to step aside or find something else to do. But she's obviously stayed because the company needs her. That is a concern I have, is like who takes Gwen Shotwell's role, and she's such an effective counterbalance to Elon and worked so well with him in pushing the company's interests forward. And frankly, the US government is super comfortable with her.
I've been covering SpaceX news for over 3 years now, and yes, there are a lot of doubters and haters that think that SpaceX can't do anything right, and they certainly have doubts about the future of Starship. But there's also a segment of people that think SpaceX isn't doing enough, that they should single-handedly take us back to the moon. Eric says while that may be a possibility in the future, Starship just isn't there yet. The goal of Starship is to make the Falcon 9 obsolete, but Starship is far away from being human-rated. So for now, yes, NASA needs SpaceX as much as SpaceX needs NASA.
I have a lot of people say, well, SpaceX should just go to the moon by themselves. Well, what are we waiting for?
Yeah.
How would you explain that to someone on, a layperson?
So I think the Artemis program is great. It's certainly the most coherent deep space exploration program we've had for humans in my lifetime. But SpaceX can't go alone right now, right? Like it's going to be a long time before people launch inside of Starship and land inside of Starship. Just a couple of weeks ago, we saw a landing mishap with the Falcon 9 rocket, right? The Starship at this point has no emergency escape system. So it has to land perfectly, I would think at least 100 times before I would get on it, before Jared Isaacman would get on it. And so it's going to take a long time before there's enough confidence in that vehicle taking off and landing vertically before people fly on it. And so, frankly, at this point, we need the SLS spacecraft and Orion. Or you could alternatively conceive of some architecture where you do a Falcon 9 Dragon, they rendezvous in low Earth orbit and go to the moon. But frankly, there's a lot that goes into a lunar program, and it's much better to have the government leading it at this point. You kind of want them out there finding the pathway, and then SpaceX can come along. You know, I expect the SLS rocket to be launching humans for the next 5 to 10 years. But at some point, SpaceX is going to nail Starship launches and landings, at which point it makes very little sense to fly on the big, expensive, expendable government vehicle. People may look at the Artemis architecture and say, well, this doesn't make any sense. But if you look at kind of the broader political context, it kind of does make sense, because for the first time in forever, you have the White House, Congress, international partners, traditional contractors, new space contractors, and us, the space-interested community, sort of all pulling in the same direction toward the moon. That has not happened in forever. There will be delays. That is the nature of spaceflight. I think the rocket is in a pretty good spot. I have some concerns about Orion, the heat shield for one, but there are also other potential concerns as well. So as we look out to Artemis 3, I'm not sure Starship is the main driver of those delays. It could be. You know, anyone who was looking at this a few years ago thinking, well, they're gonna land on the moon in 2024, 2026, that's not realistic. I mean, it's going to be later in the decade. There's just, quite frankly, the Artemis 3 mission concept is super complicated, and I just don't think all of those elements are going to come together, so they may actually have to break it down. I think there will be changes in Artemis, but stepping back from that, like, even if you were following space in the 2010s, like we had the journey to Mars, right, which was complete fiction. Like there was no basis for that, and it was all kind of this political happy talk from NASA. The Artemis is real, like, and real money is going into it, and something is going to happen. It may not look exactly like what we think, but it is coming.
I feel like as the Starliner situation has unfolded with some unfortunate, outcomes, it really shows that SpaceX was considered the underdog, maybe underestimated. And what do you think about the shift from Boeing just being so trusted to what it is today?
This book tells the story of the rise of SpaceX, the competition with Boeing, and ultimately how SpaceX surpassed Boeing. And I just think it's a traditional space company. Really, Commercial Crew was the first time SpaceX was on a level playing field with a competitor, like a traditional space competitor. Like before that, in everything else, like they were having to compete kind of uphill. But on cargo and crew, it was a level playing field, and you see what happens. Like they crushed Boeing on price, and they beat them to space by 4 years, and it's still not clear to me that Boeing is ever going to fly an operational mission on Starliner.
Well, beat them to space and also succeeded and are basically, an orbital Uber, whereas, I guess Boeing's been to space, but hardly, right? I mean,
well,
they
the astronauts have been to space and the spacecraft has been back, but there haven't been people on board it because NASA didn't think it was safe enough.
Did that shock you?
That was absolutely shocking to me.
Yeah. But in many ways, we're glad that the descent was taken seriously and we didn't have,
NASA absolutely made the right decision. I know for a fact there were many organizations within NASA who had concerns for various reasons about the crew coming home on Starliner. Let's be honest, like the odds were always that it was going to be safe to come back, and it was. But like a 1 in 10 chance of something going wrong, that's not acceptable.
Right.
I'm not even sure 1 in 100 was acceptable.
Well, especially with the historical context of Challenger and Columbia.
That's
we just
right.
Can't.
And you have a ride home for them.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So a lot of things came together. But absolutely, I was shocked because if you knew where things were a decade ago, right, with Commercial Crew versus where we ended up, it's remarkable.
Yeah. This is obviously about Falcon 9. We have Starship. Do you think you're going to write another book?
We'll see. I think eventually, hopefully I will. But, I didn't want to write the Falcon 9 book until like the program was mature and we saw where it was all going. And like, I view Starship as kind of this ball of potential, right? And the future is kind of unknowable, but very promising. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't really want to write a Starship book, I think, for at least another 5 or 10 years until we start to see where things are happening. You get a little more out of the stories. Like if you were to go interview people at SpaceX now about Starship, they'd be pretty, pretty straightforward. Whereas you want a little bit more of what really happened, and that kind of comes out
in retrospect.
In retrospect, yeah.
Well, they'd be tired. They'd probably just be too tired.
They would be tired. Isn't it crazy down there? I mean, just the maniacal energy that is happening down there is so unique when you compare it to all the other places in the space industry.
Well, I liked also, you sort of talked about Blue Origin as, you know, you have the dreamers that want a stable paycheck. And SpaceX wouldn't run without those maniacal people. And it was also interesting how many people you've interviewed that have quit SpaceX and then they're bored.
Yeah.
They go back.
Yeah, you know, Blue Origin is really interesting because they have all the money in the world. Like Elon, let's be honest, put in $200 million about into SpaceX, and he has not invested much of his personal fortune into that company since. They've had other investors, and it just has grown in value. Bezos has not derived significant revenue from Blue Origin. He's putting in on the order of $1 to $2 billion a year to keep that enterprise going. And so, yeah, for a long time it was kind of this place where you went to get a stable paycheck and you got to say you were working on something really cool, which you were, but it was just kind of off in the nebulous future. I have some hope that Blue Origin is starting to turn the corner. You know, talking to Dave Limp, the company's CEO, it's clear that his mandate is to inject a lot more urgency into Blue Origin, and you know, I have some hopes that we'll start to see them launching and landing and launching frequently and starting to provide a real competitor to SpaceX.
I feel like, you know, my audience gives them a lot of flack for these suborbital tourism space hops. They're not doing anything meaningful. Polaris Dawn splashed down, you know, this morning, so hopefully they can improve their reputation. I mean, why do you think so many people don't take Blue Origin seriously?
Well, I mean, they haven't been to orbit yet. And like the saying within the industry is, until you put a rocket into orbit, you're not a real launch company.
Right.
So I think technically New Shepard is super impressive, right?
Yeah.
What they're doing. And I think if you look at all of the potential ways to go to space out there today and in the near future, for most people, that's probably the best bet, because you don't have, I mean, Polaris Dawn, I mean, they trained hard for those missions, and they're in that capsule for 5 days, which is, I think, is a long time to be in a pretty contained space. I'm not sure I have the right stuff for that. I certainly admire them. But Blue Origin, you know, you go up there and it's like 10 or 15 minutes and you get the whole experience of a launch and a landing and weightlessness and looking down at Earth. It's pretty great. Unfortunately, it's very expensive, and I don't ever see that sort of becoming like an option open to hundreds of people a year. But, you know, that is feeding forward into the New Glenn rocket, and that is a super impressive vehicle. And hopefully we'll see it launch soon.
Jeff Bezos he did 2 interviews, or a 2-part series with Tim Dodd, so it makes me think that they are getting ready to share more. I think that some of the frustration is the lack of transparency compared to SpaceX, which is like...
And I'm not even sure SpaceX has a huge amount of transparency, but you can see what they're doing, right? It's like right there. Like, you've got like rockets launching, you've got them landing. You can go to Best Buy and buy a Starlink dish and get satellite from space, right? High speed. I mean, it's all right out there in the open. Whereas Blue Origin, they can't point to these achievements and say this, and this. So I think their mentality is like, we want to wait until we have something to show off before we really show it off. And
right.
I do expect them to start to be more open as things go forward.
SpaceX does a pretty good job of showing off their accomplishments. Most recently, live streaming the first ever private commercial spacewalk in brand new SpaceX spacesuits. It's incredible to see how successful this Polaris Dawn mission was. But while we see a lot from the ground at Starbase on the side of the road, and even from up in the air thanks to RGV aerial photography, there are so many stories behind the scenes about the people that have made the company what it is today, who have sacrificed countless hours with family, missing major milestones in their own life to propel SpaceX forward and get us closer to this mission and this dream of going to Mars.
Some people may be thinking, well, I've followed SpaceX since the beginning of the Falcon 9. I've watched all the launches. I mean, I know about Starlink. I saw Falcon Heavy. You know, why do I need to read a book about it? The goal was to tell the story behind the story. And so, yes, you may have known that the Falcon Heavy launched Elon's Tesla, but why?
Right.
And like, How did they make that work?
I am not sponsored by Eric, and I am not making any money off of promoting this book. I sincerely want you, my space nerd friends, to know that if you've already read Liftoff, Re-entry is just as good. Once the book releases, I'd like to make another series of shorts like I did with Liftoff, sharing some of the cool and unique stories that you probably don't know about. But until then, I hope that you enjoyed this interview and this overview of SpaceX. SpaceX has undoubtedly changed my life, essentially giving me a full-time job covering what they're doing. I, like Eric, hope that they succeed, and I really want us to get to Mars in my lifetime. If you enjoyed this video, please consider sharing it with a friend, and also please subscribe to Ellie in Space if you haven't already. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next video.